When Tristan, our firstborn, was old enough to enjoy stories, I began a tradition of telling her about a little girl named Tristan and her friend Barney, a giraffe who wore striped overalls and could magically transport the two of them to any place, real or imagined. And in the stories, Barney and Tristan went to known parks and other places that we actually frequented, but often to storylands and places that we made up. At each tale's end, Barney and Tristan stopped someplace for ice cream, and Barney always ordered vanilla ice cream with ketchup. And while the stories were fantastical, they always had the truthful theme of Tristan being loved and the world being full of wonder and awe. And for Nancy and me, the Barney and Tristan stories also included the joy of watching our lovely wide-eyed preschooler enraptured without disbelief as each adventure unfolded. And it wasn't that our little girl was unable to discern the real world from the one in the Barney story. She could. It was that she gladly and instantly set aside disbelief in order to imagine inhabiting that fantasy world in her mind. She became a willing bystander following in the adventures. And our other children heard similar stories and wandered on such adventures too. Adults often think only children do that hopping out of reality stuff, but actually adults do something similar when we read fiction or watch TV, movies, plays. We set reality aside a little so that we can enter into the world depicted in order to best perceive the story. And in stories, real or imagined, the human mind kind of partially teleports out of reality and into the narrative. And provided there isn't something that jars us back to reality, we willingly participate in the story as if we're a character, like a fly on the wall, or better yet, an unseen spirit watching the story unfold. And so while we may in reality be sitting in our living room or a theater, a part of our mind hovers in the story where we accept the not presently really happening world as presently happening. It's pretty cool. Stage actors are even trained to understand the audience as a character participating in the scene. And if a play is done right, the audience buys in and transports themselves as bystanders into the scenes. Theater folk call it the willing suspension of disbelief. And the idea goes all the way back to Aristotle, who noticed that audiences set aside critical thinking about whether a story is real or not and agreed to pretend that it was. If a stage production is done well, the audience hops into the story until it's over or they're jarred back to reality. Can't put it down. Books are like that too. We buy into well-told stories so well, sometimes we want to stay in them. And while adults can and do willingly suspend disbelief, things can stop us more so than they can for children. Modern adults in the West are particularly prone to apply science and historical accuracy to stories that children don't apply. And so adults have a tendency to reject stories that don't appear fact-based. Factual accuracy is a thing that can keep us getting into or jar us out of the story by destroying the suspension of disbelief. And sadly, historicity and science dogmatically applied can keep us from fully appreciating or experiencing good stories. All of which leads me to today's lesson Susie read so well on the Transfiguration of Christ. When the Gospel of Matthew was written, the types of historicity and science modern adults commonly use today as lenses for stories weren't around. Before the Enlightenment, people didn't typically approach Bible stories insisting the contents add up in what we call a logical or scientific way. Back in the day, empirical proof was not the be-all, end-all of truth. Truth wasn't limited to hard evidence. The specific truths in the context of Jesus' era that are relevant to our lesson include that Old Testament stories had Moses speaking to God in a cloud, meeting God on a mountaintop and experiencing a luminous transfiguration himself when he was given the law, a law that he brought off the mountain. Moses and Elijah in the Old Testament both experienced being rejected by people and being vindicated by God. And both in the Jewish tradition have stories in the Bible or otherwise about being taken directly to heaven. And Elijah was also supposed to return before the Messiah arrived. In Bible times, a vision, as Jesus calls the event in our lesson, could be a dream or a trance that revealed supernatural appearances and revelations, things that could not be filmed if film was available. And all of these images and symbols and revelations of truth are in the reading and made a part of Jesus' story. Prophets and God met Jesus on a mountain. Jesus was transfigured and glowed. God appeared as a bright cloud and spoke to Jesus' followers. And Jesus came off the mountain like a new Moses. He himself as the new law. And at the time Matthew was written, he was known to the audience as the Messiah, the Son of God, who also ascended to heaven. Those are truths about how Jesus was experienced in Matthew's community. And they're accurate, whether the story is understood as fact or fiction or a mixture of both, or as Jesus calls it, a vision. Any insistence that literalism, historicity, or science must be applied misses the truth in the story and the ultimate truth in Christianity, that Jesus is the decisive revelation of God to whom Christians are to listen. As God in the vision puts it, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." And note that this ultimate truth told by God to Jesus has three parts. Jesus is God's beloved Son. God is well pleased with Jesus. And we are to listen to Jesus. There's not a word spoken by God in the vision about beliefs in literalism, inerrancy, or belief in Jesus, whatever that means. There's nothing suggesting historicity and science apply or are needed to find truth. The truth Christians are to take away from this story is that Jesus came down to his followers as the new Messiah, the new law, the new Moses, and the Son of God. And no matter how we come at this story, the truth for Jesus' followers is Jesus is God's beloved Son, with whom God is well pleased, and we are to listen to him. And this lines up with truth that for Christians, Jesus is the decisive revelation of God. What he tells us we are to listen to. And I find great comfort in that, because whether we think it is fiction or non-fiction or a mixture of both, what Jesus is recorded as saying, if we listen, is about how to get and give well-being. It is about peace on earth, goodwill to all. I've summarized up here before how we can do that. It's what we can hear Jesus teaching us when we listen, that God is love, that we're to believe in love, we are to love love, and most important, we are to be love. And I hear that without concern about whether the stories about Jesus and his teachings are literal, scientific, or historical. I experience the stories to be poetic and parabolic. Such experiences have led me to personally believe that summary is decisively true, that God is love. We are to believe in love, love, and be love. I find that belief full of truth, full of love, full of wonder and awe. And I love that the images in our lesson are mystical, picking up the wonder and awe with spirits of great prophecy, bright shining Jesus, and a bright misty cloud providing the voice of God, validating Jesus. This religious stuff that we do always has elements of mystery to it. Our very existence, life, has a mystical side. In our lesson, creation and the Creator and love are experienced shrouded literally in a mysterious cloud that speaks to us. We are to follow the voice because it speaks to the depths of our being as Christians. It tells us Jesus is the Son of God. It tells us to listen to Jesus. And when we listen, we sense Jesus speaking in and to the depth of our very being. And what Jesus speaks reveals truth to us, decisive truth. But sadly, the decisive truths revealed by Jesus in the Bible started getting knocked out of whack when some theologians, less than 200 years ago, started to insist that the Bible stories were meant to be records of historic events that couldn't be challenged. And then, in turn, that caused others to insist, well then, they're false records when science and historicity are applied. In these debates, science, historicity, and the Bible are misused by both sides. The Bible doesn't insist to be read as literally true and inerrant. Science and historicity aren't meant for measuring truths in Bible stories and empirical evidence sort of way. And yet we hear people insist the Bible is a record of events that everyone must read as literally true historic facts. And in response, we often hear science and historicity applied to that literalism to show the Bible is not history or science, and that it's typically declared as lacking any truth. And no one has to agree with me, but I see both sides as way off base. None of the Bible was written in the context of the Enlightenment, where science and historicity measure truth. Nothing in the Bible claims it is an affidavit of cold, hard facts we have to buy into. Indeed, the truth is that Bible stories were all created in times and places untethered to science and historicity for expressions of truth. Truth was understood to exist in symbol and metaphor and in blended mixtures of them with facts. And we modern folk allow for this sort of truth in poems and songs and fiction stories and even in depicted stories of history. But a lot of us balk at it in Bible stories because people keep treating them as written to be purely factual accounts, which they aren't. Bible stories often mix history and metaphors and people and parables. And you know what? It doesn't really matter whether the story took place in a way that could be videotaped today, or if it's all fiction, or if it's all a mixture of fact and fiction. What matters is whether they help us find truth. Can they help us experience love, wonder, awe? Today's lesson seems fantastical, yet taken in the context of Matthew, we can find it full of love, wonder, and awe. With all that background, I'm going to close by reading our lesson again. And as I do, keep in mind Matthew's context, that Jesus is understood to be like a radiant new Moses as well as the new law, and that Elijah came back in the vision before Jesus became the Messiah. And keep in mind, too, that God appears in a cloud as he did to Moses, and that God tells us who Jesus is to Christians and what Christians need to do. And finally, willingly suspend disbelief as I read it, just for a few moments. Picture the story as if you are there. If it might help, feel free to close your eyes. Tony does that most of my sermons anyway. Listen now to the Transfiguration story from Matthew 17. Jesus took with him Peter, James, and his brother John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. As he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. And suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up, do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The end. The story of truth from the Gospel of Matthew. One more thing, the Son of Man has been raised so we can tell everyone about this vision. We can tell them what Peter, James, and John heard, the truth of God's very own assertion that Jesus is God's beloved Son, that God is well pleased with Jesus, and we are to listen to Jesus.